Boldwood presents Winter at the Dog and Duck, written by Jill Steeples and read by Beth Lilly. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. As I walked along Bluebell Lane in Little Leyton that bright and sunny morning, I could almost imagine myself to be Snow White. It really was that perfect. Everything was peaceful and tranquil. The only sounds to be heard were the call of birdsong twittering in my ears and the gentle rustle of activity from the wildlife scurrying around in the depths of the woodland countryside. Already this morning, we'd been accompanied on our walk by squirrels and rabbits, come face to face with a startled muntjac deer before it had darted back into the trees, and spotted a heron standing tall and proud at the river's edge. All around me, buds blossomed on the trees, offering the promise of new beginnings. I took a deep breath, contentment filling my soul. Ah, yes, this is the life. Not even my mobile vibrating in my pocket could spoil the rural idyll. Okay, so maybe it could. Unable to ignore its insistent demands, I paused, whipping it out from the back pocket of my jeans to check my messages before... Milo? A heavy splash of water and the sound of frantic scrabbling snatched my head up from my phone. I'd only stopped for a moment, surely not long enough for my charge to do one of his disappearing acts. Milo! I tucked my phone in my back pocket again. Where are you? I looked up and down the lane, the path we'd already traced along the side of Bluebell Woods, but there was no sign of the little cockapoo. Milo rarely ventured very far from my side, and a swirl of anxiety stirred in my chest. I dashed across the path, standing on tiptoes to peer through the trees and then down the steep, muddy bank that led to the river. Oh, geez! There he was. My heart stopped. His white, curly head was bobbing up and down in the water, his tongue hanging out to the side, a wild look in his normally affable brown eyes. Come here, Milo, I called, more in hope than in expectation, before I clambered over the wire netting and slid down the hill. No problem, I thought, my breathing picking up a pace now. All dogs are natural-born swimmers, aren't they? Good boy, this way. I beckoned from the river's edge. I clapped my hands on my thighs and made little clawing motions with my arms so that Milo might get the idea, but he wasn't having any of it, and instead seemed to be doing his abject best to swallow as much water as possible, making horrible gurgling noises in the process. Oh, crikey, Milo, come on! You can do this! Please don't drown! Mrs. Anderson will never forgive me! Looking like he had every intention of ignoring me, I wriggled out of my jacket and threw it on the ground behind me, ignoring the cold nip to the air. There was only one thing for it. If I wanted to take Milo home with me, and I most certainly did, it wouldn't be good publicity for my fledgling dog-sitting business if I inadvertently killed off one of the little darlings before I'd got through the first month. Then I was going to have to wade in and rescue the little scamp. Thankful that I was wearing my brand new bright pink wellies, bought especially for my dog-walking adventures, I gingerly took a step into the water. Then another step. Slowly, carefully, I navigated my way through a bunch of straggly reeds until suddenly the riverbed dropped several inches beneath my feet. My heart plummeted as I fell with a thud into the murky depths of the river, cold water filling my wellies to the brim. Oh no! Ugh! I shuddered. That is disgusting. Cold seeped into my bones and everywhere else too. Milo! The silly dog had chosen that particular moment to discard his water wings and finally decide to swim in the opposite direction to me. Terrific. Come here! I lurched forward, narrowly avoiding landing face down in the water, and scooped up the smelly, dripping dog into my arms. I gathered my breath for a moment before turning round and attempting to wade my way through the surprisingly strong current, muttering all sorts of curses into Milo's ear. You all right? A clipped masculine voice reached my ears. Need a hand? Tumbling down onto the bank, spilling Milo onto the ground, my hands crawled through the mud as I struggled to attach Milo's lead, not wanting him to repeat his escape routine. Next time, he wouldn't even be given the opportunity, that was for sure. I heaved up my heavy, dripping body out of the water, found my legs and stood up, turning around to see whoever it was talking to me. On the opposite side of the riverbank, a man dressed in a wax jacket, flanked by two sleek and smooth gun dogs, was observing me keenly. I gathered my breath and my galloping heartbeat. Tall, dark, and inevitably handsome. Oh, God. Really? Now was definitely not the time nor the place. I'm fine, thank you. My cheeks flared with heat, and my long hair swept all around my face, obscuring my view of the man. I shivered, goosebumps running across my skin. Sweeping my hair off my face, I fixed on a smile, trying to give the impression that I wasn't wet through and freezing cold, but I suspected I wasn't fooling anyone. The man's eyes narrowed and his lips, a wide, generous mouth I noticed, moved imperceptibly. A puddle accumulated at my feet as the water ran off me and Milo took the moment to shake his body vigorously, seemingly none the worse for his ice bath, showering me all over again. The dog got into trouble in the water, but it's all okay now. I wiped my brow with the sleeve of my jumper and bent down to retrieve my coat from the ground. Not that it would be offering me much warmth with every other item of my clothing completely sodden. You're soaked through. Are you sure you're okay? My place is only across the other side of the field if you want to come back and dry off. Get yourself cleaned up. It was very nice of him to offer, but quite frankly, the last thing I wanted to do was prolong the embarrassment. This particular humiliation was one I had no desire to share with anyone, especially not now I had the opportunity to study the man more closely. Good-looking was probably an insult to his distinctive brand of attractiveness. About 6'2", I reckoned, with broad shoulders, messed-up hair and dark, all-knowing eyes. Sod's law, isn't it? You scan a dozen dating websites from the comfort of your sofa and don't come across anyone remotely fanciable, and then, in the freezing cold, soaked through, looking like a bedraggled rat, you happen upon someone half-decent. Who was I kidding? He was definitely more than half-decent. Really, it's fine. I'm not far from home either. I didn't like the way his dogs were looking at me, with haughty disdain, as though they would never act in such a disobedient fashion as Milo. Judging by the way the hounds stood tall and proud, looking up at their master, watching his every move and listening out for his every word, I imagined they would never dare take a step out of line. Mind you, don't they say dogs are like their owners? The aura of superiority wafting from over the other side of the riverbank was palpable. Thanks anyway, I said, giving the man a cheery wave, anxious now to get away as the cold chilled my bones. With as much dignity as I could muster, I turned and marched away, without so much as a backward glance. It was only as Milo and I made our way home that I wondered where, Admittedly, I'd been away from Little Leyton for a few years, but it was only a small village, and I liked to think I still knew everyone in the area. Which was ridiculous, really. Things had moved on in my absence. I'd been to university, worked 3 years in the city, and qualified as an accountant. I could hardly expect to come home and pick up where I'd left off, as the good-looking stranger had proved. Little Leyton would always be home to me, but with my parents abroad, Dad had recently secured a 9-month contract in Dubai, and with most of my old friends from school off doing their own thing, I was beginning to wonder whether it had been a good move to come back after all. At the top of the lane, I stopped to look back down the hill. I took a deep breath and surveyed the stunning countryside before me, swathes of rolling green fields as far as the eye could see. Despite the sogginess around my nether regions, nothing could detract from the beauty of the landscape. A reason, if I'd been searching for one, why I would always be drawn back here. Nestled at the bottom of the valley were the imposing buildings of the Braithwaite estate. The one-time home of the Earl of Braithwaite, the Georgian manor house had fallen into disrepair and had remained derelict for many years, but in recent times it had undergone an extensive redevelopment and now shone like a jewel in the countryside. Beyond the estate, you could make out the new housing estate which had sprung up whilst I was away. That was obviously where the man must have meant. I'd forgotten all about the new development. It had been in the planning stages when I'd left, and now it looked to be a busy, vibrant community. Milo jumped up at my legs, urging me to get a move on. "Come on then, boy," I said. "Let's get you home." Shivering from the cold, we picked up the pace and strode past the lovely wooden lich gate that led to St. Cuthbert's, the Saxon church where Mum and Dad had married and where I'd been christened, a place that had played such a significant role in my upbringing. I'd attended so many events there over the years. Easter services, summer fairs, harvest festivals and Christingle services too. It was good to know that whatever changes had occurred in Little Leyton, some things would always stay the same. Definitely, the pleasures of working and living in Little Leyton had to beat doing battle on a jam-packed tube train in London. Okay, so maybe dog-sitting and doing some shifts at the Dog and Duck didn't quite have the same kudos as working for one of the big 5 consulting companies in the city, but for the time being, it suited me fine. After all, this was never intended as a permanent move. When I was made redundant, suddenly and unexpectedly, coinciding with the lease on my poky little flat in London coming up for renewal, and the landlord I decided, on something of a whim admittedly, that it was an ideal opportunity for me to return home. My sizable payout from the company had bought me some thinking time, and I wanted to make sure my next move was the right one. 3 months at home would be the ideal opportunity to reassess my life and work out what it was I wanted to do next. There was absolutely no need to panic. Not yet. I could walk into another high-paying job in the city tomorrow if I wanted to. And flats to let were aplenty in London. The last thing I wanted was to have a knee-jerk reaction to my change in circumstances. Rain started to fall on my shoulders, and I pulled up the hood of my jacket and tugged on Milo's lead. Absolutely. This was where I wanted to be, living an easy and uncomplicated life with only recalcitrant dogs to worry about. An unscheduled dip in the river was nothing compared to back-to-back meetings and late nights in the office. This new regime would be perfect. It might take a bit of getting used to. That was all. Chapter 2. Before returning Milo to Mrs. Anderson, I made a detour back home. Not something I did as part of my normal range of services, but this was a case of desperate measures. I didn't want Mrs. Anderson knowing about Milo's unexpected dip in the river and had sworn him to secrecy, but the dank, rank smell emanating from the end of the lead was seriously off-putting and might be a bit of a giveaway. Ugh. I screwed up my nose, deciding it might be safer to breathe through my mouth. In the kitchen, I ran some warm water in the sink, adding some dog shampoo and gave the stinking hound a thorough washing down. Not an easy job when Milo was doing his best to wriggle out of my grasp and shake the excess water, of which there was plenty, all over the walls. I was only thankful that Mum wasn't around to see the mess we'd made in her kitchen. My parents had already left for Dubai by the time I'd returned to Little Leyton, and they were more than happy for me to house-sit for them. Saved me from having to pay rent too, so it worked out to be the ideal situation all round. With Milo newly coiffed and me changed out of my soaked clothes and into some clean, dry ones, we were about to leave the house when my phone buzzed into action. It was an unrecognised number, so immediately I went into business mode. "Good morning, a dog's best friend, Ellie Browne speaking. How can I help?" Every time I said the name of my new dog-sitting business aloud, I couldn't stop the big smile from spreading across my face. My own boss. I could still hardly believe it. Answerable to no one. My most demanding client was a boxer called Bruno. That was the dog, and not his owner, who pulled on the lead so much he nearly tore my arm out of its socket. But that was as exacting as it got. And besides, I was working on training Bruno out of his bad habits. We still had a long way to go, but I was a lot more forgiving of Bruno and his funny ways than I was of some of my difficult and awkward clients in London. The lady on the other end of the phone, Ruler, had heard about my services from her friend, another one of my clients, Gemma Jones, and was asking for details on pricing and availability. What I'll do is pop some information through your letterbox, which will give you all the details you need. And if you'd like me to come along and meet Rocky, then I'd be more than happy to do so. I set a reminder on my phone to pop round to Ruler's later on my way to my shift at the pub. First, though, I needed to get Milo home. "Oh, my goodness, Ellie," said Mrs. Anderson when she opened her front door to greet us. "What on earth have you done to Milo?" My chest filled with dread as she took off her glasses and leaned forward to peer at her dog. "He looks like a completely different animal." My laughter rang out, not entirely naturally. "Well, he got a bit muddy on our walk, so I thought I'd give him a little spruce up." Maybe I'd overdone the teasing of his white curls. He did look as though he'd just come from the hairdresser's with a new shampoo and set. "That's a very good service. You don't get that from me, do you, Milo? Oh, my precious little boy. He always gets filthy on our walks. You were lucky he didn't jump in the river. That's his usual trick." "Really?" I said, fixing a grin on my face. And she decided only now to tell me. "Oh, yes, he can be a right little scamp at times. He was probably on his best behaviour for you. He seems to have enjoyed himself, though. Shall we say same time next week? Great. I'll pop it in the diary." With a note not to let Milo off the lead again, although I did hope Mrs. Anderson wouldn't expect the full wash and blow-dry treatment every week. The bookings in the diary were coming thick and fast. When I'd first come home from London, I realised I'd need something to fill my days, something undemanding and enjoyable, and that's where the dog walking came in. I made up some promotional leaflets on the computer and popped them through the doors of all the houses in the village. Within days, I had my first customers, and word of the services I was offering had quickly spread. Growing up, we'd always had dogs at home, and I missed not having one of my own. It had been an impossibility in London, and a dog of my own wasn't a viable option now, not knowing how long I'd be staying around. But working with a selection of my four-legged friends meant I really did get the best of both worlds. It was a dream come true. Along with my shifts at the pub, not that it felt like proper work at all. Although I was shattered and collapsed into bed each night, falling asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow, it was a contented, satisfied slumber that greeted me. I didn't come away at the end of the day feeling so overwhelmed with fatigue that I could weep, spending the rest of the night tossing and turning, unable to switch off, before having to get up early and go back through the motions the next day. My shoulders didn't groan with tension, and my eyes were no longer sore and tired after having stared at a computer screen for 8 hours. All the fresh air I was getting meant the pounding headaches, which were a permanent feature of my working week in London, had all but disappeared. As an added bonus, I'd lost 1/2 a stone in weight. Hardly surprising, really, considering all the walking I'd been doing. Today, I had one more doggy assignment for my client, Mrs. Elmore, who was recovering from a hip replacement operation. Her little border terrier, Rosie, was an absolute sweetheart, who at almost 12 years old walked even slower than Mrs. Elmore, and who stopped at every leaf and every sweet-smelling delight on our route. Still, it made for a very leisurely and relaxing walk around the block. There was no fear of any repeats of Milo's swimming lesson with Rosie, and a pleasant end to the day job. Afterwards, I rushed home for a quick sandwich and a cup of tea before heading to the pub for the evening shift, a stint pulling pints for the locals. On the high street, nestled between Josh Reynolds' antiques on one side A quirky shop selling old collectibles and more modern objets d'art, and Polly's Flowers on the other, was the unassuming 18th century building that housed the Dog and Duck. Nothing much to look at from the outside, but as soon as you stepped inside, you couldn't help but be charmed by the sprawling, appealing rooms. Low black beams, an open fire, a bread oven tucked behind the stairs that led to the living quarters, and lots of little nooks and crannies filled with old books and comfy cushions made for an inviting welcome. Walking into the pub always incited a feeling of coming home for me, but then I had spent far too much time in there, propping up the bar, in my formative years. "I meant to ask you, Els," said Josie, taking advantage of the early evening lull and parking her bottom on a stool. "Could you possibly take on any more shifts?" Josie was Eric, the landlord's daughter, and my best friend since, well, it seemed like forever. "When were you thinking?" "Lunchtimes, evenings, whatever you can do, really. To be honest, I'm ready to stop now. By the end of a shift, my legs are killing me and my back—" She winced as she rubbed at her side. Laughing, she looked down at her bump, which was straining beneath the material of her blouse. She still had 6 weeks to go until B-Day, but now she came to mention it, navigating around her wide berth in the small confines of the bar was becoming tricky. "Dad's advertising for extra staff at the moment, but I thought, in the meantime, if you wanted some more hours?" "Sure. I'm happy to fit in as many shifts as I can, around my dog-walking clients, of course." Josie lifted her eyebrows, twisting her mouth in an indulgent smile. She was one of many people who couldn't quite believe how my life had changed in the space of a few months. Gone were the power suits, high heels and polished nails, replaced by jeans and sweatshirts, wellies and the whiff of the great outdoors. I really rather liked the new me. "Brilliant. You're a lifesaver," she said. "It's going to be weird not having you behind the bar, though. Who will I have my girly chats with?" Josie was my oldest friend. Our mums met at the Daisy Chain Mothers and Toddlers group in the village hall over 24 years ago and had quickly become best friends, a friendship that had remained strong until Miriam, Josie's mum, died unexpectedly after a short illness when Josie was still a teenager. Like our mums, we'd been besties from day one. Going to school together, sharing birthday celebrations, holidays, and everything in between. We'd chosen different paths, Josie seeking out the security of marriage and motherhood, me opting for a career, but our friendship was as solid as ever. When Josie had found out I was coming home, she'd quickly arranged with her dad for me to take up some shifts at the pub, which had given us the opportunity to spend most evenings together, gossiping behind the bar in the guise of working. "Mind you, I should take off as much time as you can," I told her now. "You won't get much rest when the baby arrives, and, knowing your dad, he'll have you back here before the little one's first tooth has arrived." "Well, to be honest, that's what I was banking on. We'll certainly need the money, but I'm not sure it'll happen now." "Really?" I pulled up a stool and sat down next to her. Our only customers, Bill and Tony, a couple of our lovely regulars, were supping on their pints in the snug and putting the world to rights, so Josie and I wouldn't need to be pulling any pints anytime soon. "Why not?" "Dad's tenancy is due to run out, and he's not sure it'll be renewed. Apparently the owners are selling up, so we don't know yet what will happen with this place, who might buy it, what they intend to do with it. Dad's thinking it might be time for him to move on." "No, surely not. Your dad is the heart and soul of this place. It wouldn't be the same without him. Wouldn't the new owner? If it's a chain, they'll probably want to implement some changes and bring their own people in. Turn it into a gastropub, maybe. Or worse still, put in a couple of sports TVs and a pool table. Ugh, I hope not." We both shuddered, trying to imagine what that might be like. The best thing about the Dog and Duck was that it managed to retain its sense of oldie-worldy charm. It was a pub in the true sense of the word, a quiet sanctuary away from the pressing demands of the outside world. There were no blaring TVs or loud music, no flashing lights from arcade machines. Eric, Josie's dad, had strived to make the pub a community environment, welcoming to not only the real ale fans, young couples and families who frequented the place, but also to local groups, such as the book club, the conversational Italian class, and the group of young men who sat huddled around one of the tables, exchanging magic cards. Everyone was welcome as long as they showed respect to their fellow customers and the staff, and if they didn't, Eric was always on hand to discreetly but firmly move them on their way. "Don't say anything to anyone, will you?" said Josie, looking concerned. "I think Dad wants to keep it under wraps until he knows more about what's happening." "Of course," I said, reeling at the news that the pub might change hands after all this time. I couldn't get it out of my head and was still thinking about it later that night, long after Josie had gone home. From a purely selfish point of view, I couldn't imagine the pub being any other way than the way it was now, in my heart and mind, with everything and everybody that was familiar around me. Working for anyone other than Eric was inconceivable too. Our families had always been close and we'd shared so many happy and special occasions here. Summer parties, charity auctions, Christmas celebrations. It was heartbreaking to think there'd be no more of those events in our future. "Hello, sweetheart." I looked up from where I'd been lost in my thoughts, returning clean glasses to the shelf below the bar. There was only one person who called me sweetheart, Johnny Tay. I smiled, ignoring the flutter of unease in my chest, and plastered on my best barmaid's warm welcome. "Hi, Johnny. What can I get you? A pint of the usual?" "No, I'm not stopping. I just wanted to pop in to say hello." He stood on tiptoe and leant over the bar, taking my face in his hands and depositing a big kiss on my lips. He smelt delicious, of wood chippings, fresh air and grass. "I'm going down to the Bell to watch the match, but I'll drop in on the way back. Walk you home? We could drop off at mine for a nightcap." "Oh, don't worry about that. I was thinking I'd have an early night anyway." He grinned at me, his bright blue eyes twinkling fondly. "Okay, I'll see you later then." That was the trouble with Johnny. He was too damn likeable for his own good. Friendly and charming was his default mode. I liked him. No, scrap that. I adored Johnny. We'd become really close friends in sixth form, spending far too much time together in the common room at school, sharing our woes about revision, talking about our plans for the summer when exams were over, lazing in the park, spending hours nursing our beers in the garden of the Dog and Duck, confiding in each other, growing closer with each passing day. It was inevitable that our relationship would grow into something more serious. A teenage romance that had soared that glorious summer and fizzled out just as quickly when I'd gone off to university in the autumn. Whatever had possessed me to think it was a good idea to pick up where we'd left off all those years before? Ugh. That first weekend when I came home from London, I hadn't thought twice about falling into Johnny's arms again. It was all too easy. I revelled in the reminder of his warm voice and the familiarity of his lovely face as we reacquainted ourselves with what had been happening over the last couple of years, catching up on the news about the old crowd from school. Our lives had gone in different directions. Me, studying hard, gaining a qualification that would always guarantee me a decent job, I hoped, and Johnny taking up an apprenticeship with a local joinery company, his innate skills and creativity soon enabling him to set up his own bespoke kitchen company. No surprise there, because as I was rediscovering, if there was one thing you could say about Johnny, it was that he was very good with his hands. I could see now that Johnny and I were very different people, and we worked much better as friends than anything more. The trouble was, Johnny hadn't realised it. He'd taken to calling me sweetheart, turning up at the pub whenever I was working a shift and talking about a future. Admittedly, only 2 or 3 weeks down the line, but it still managed to scare the heebie-jeebies out of me. Despite what my head was telling me, that I needed to put a stop to what was only ever meant to be a fling, I realised I was getting myself in much deeper than I'd ever intended, and alarm bells were ringing between my ears. Coming home was meant to give me some clarity, to offer me the opportunity to live a simpler, less stressful life. But with each passing day spent in Little Leyton, it looked as though life was getting more complicated by the moment. Note to self. I definitely needed to do something about the problem called Johnny. Chapter 3. There you go, my lovely. These are for you, Ellie. It was the start of my shift the next day, and Polly Sampson from the flower shop next door. Wow, they're stunning, thank you. No problem. I hate to see any flowers go to waste, and I know you'll find a good use for them. I took them from her, found a vase and placed them in the fireplace, standing back for a moment to admire them. Perfect! I was going to take them home with me, but I think they found their rightful place there, don't you? I loved the quiet of the early evenings in the pub when I had the opportunity to potter and chat properly with any customers who popped in. Often, later in the evening, I was too busy to even draw breath, so I always made the most of the quiet times when I could. I plopped some ice into a glass, poured in some orange juice and handed the drink to Polly. Immediately, she took a long sip, her eyes brightening as the refreshment hit the desired spot. So, no regrets then? She asked. About coming back here? I should imagine life in Little Leyton must seem tame after living in London for so long. Polly was a friend who I'd known since my school days. We hadn't been close back then. She'd been in the year above me, and we'd mixed in different circles. But in recent months, with her working next door, we'd got to know each other better and had grown much closer as a result. It's different, I'll give you that, but this is very definitely my home, where I belong. I loved the sense of community here. You really don't get that in London. Or else I didn't find it. My life seemed to consist of early starts, long days, and late nights. It's only now that I'm away from it that I realise how burnt out I was. I'd gone straight from university into my job, doing my accountancy exams at the same time, and it was really pressurised. Losing my job like that so suddenly was devastating, but in some ways I see it as a blessing. It's given me the chance to step back from it all and decide what I want to do next. Polly nodded, taking another sip from her drink. She wriggled her shoulders and exhaled deeply, the tensions of her day seeping from her body. Well, I hope you're here to stay, Ellie. I do love having you around. You've brightened up this place, that's for sure. Such a lovely thing for Polly to say. She was tiny in stature, but had a huge heart. With her blonde hair cut into a swingy bob and bright blue eyes that shone keenly as she spoke, my mood always lifted just at the sight of her. With her being only next door, I often popped into her shop before or after a shift to have a natter and a cup of coffee. I'd perch my bottom on one of the stools behind the counter and watch transfixed as her fingers tended her flowers, creating pretty bouquets and baskets with expert ease. I'm not sure how long I'll be around, I told her. I love working here and doing the dog sitting, but I don't see either of them as long-term careers. I'll probably have to go. Which was absolutely true. So why, as I said the words aloud, did I wonder, not for the first time, if I really wanted to pick up that lifestyle again? Thinking about it, I'd been feeling the strain for months, and a stirring of disquiet rumbled in the depths of my stomach as I wondered if the career I had chosen, the one I had worked so long and hard for, was really meant for me after all. So you didn't leave anybody behind in London then? Polly shifted her bottom on the stool. They weren't the most comfortable seats in the world, and the corners of her mouth twisted in an inquiring smile. I tilted my head, deliberately misunderstanding the question. I wondered if it might have been a man that brought you back here, if you weren't trying to escape a broken heart. Ha! No, I sighed. 4 years in London, and I don't think I could have had more than a couple of dates. Really? Polly's mouth gaped open, and I thought my love life was in the doldrums. Yeah, I gave a small chuckle, unable to take offence at her reaction. How could I when it was the sad truth? To be honest, for a long time I wasn't really interested in relationships. I was too focused on my job, and then when I was ready to meet someone, it never seemed to happen. Maybe if I had done, I wouldn't have come home again. A pang of sadness swept over me as I was made to consider all those missed opportunities. Still, it looks like things are going well with Johnny now. That has to be a good thing, eh? Do you know, I sometimes think these things happen for a reason. That maybe you were meant to come home, to be here at the pub and to be with Johnny." "What? No," I said quickly, hearing the defensive edge to my voice. I jumped up from my stool and cleared away some empty glasses from the top. "We're not really together. Johnny and I just friends, nothing more." Polly raised her eyebrows at me, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Really?" I said, feeling a heat rise to my cheeks as I tried to convince us both. Okay. But I'm not sure Johnny sees it that way." "Well, he should." I let out a big sigh. If other people were seeing us as a couple, then my problem was much bigger than I thought. "What about you?" I asked, eager to deflect the attention from me. "Are you seeing anyone?" "No." Polly's shoulders sagged. "The one thing you can say about Little Leyton is that there is a distinct lack of eligible young men. I'd love to meet someone, but I'm not sure how I'm supposed to do that around here." "No," I sighed in sympathy, looking around us. Bill and Tony, lovely men in their 60s, were supping on their pints in the snug. A group of building contractors had just come in after a long day's work and were discussing last night's football match, sat in the bay window. If the dog and duck was anything to go by, then she had a point. "Don't you meet any nice men through your work?" "Oh yes, plenty. But they're all either happily married or trying to woo a potential partner. I work in a florist's, remember? It's not the best place to meet single available men." "No, I suppose not. One of these days I might try internet dating. I never really liked the idea of it before, but it might be worth a try, or else—" "A nunnery," I interrupted her with a wry smile before turning to greet a customer who'd just walked in through the side door. He ducked his head to avoid the low beams before he rested his hands on the bar and lifted his gaze to greet me. "Good evening, sir. What can—" I paused as our eyes met, realization dawning in my mind. "Oh, hello. Be still, my beating heart. What can I get you?" Standing in front of me was the man from the lane, minus his 2 dogs. His large, masculine physical presence filled the cosy confines of the snug. Up close, I was able to reassess my first impression of him. Tall? Check. Much taller and broader than I remembered, actually. Dark? Check. Eyes, the colour of melted chocolate, that flickered with curiosity and messy dark brown hair that curled on his collar. Handsome? Check. Strong features with the finest shadow of stubble across his wide jawline and the faintest hint of a scar above his lip. Oh yes, definitely handsome. From the corner of my eye, I noticed Polly raising an eyebrow at me, her half-smile suggesting that she very much approved of my latest customer. It was almost as if the goddess of dating had been eavesdropping on our conversation and had sent down a shining ray of hope in the form of this man, telling us to keep the faith. "Hello," he said with a warm smile of recognition. "I'll have a pint of the special, please." Why were my fingers shaking all of a sudden? I pulled his pint carefully, grateful to fix my attention on the golden nectar filling the glass, allowing me the opportunity for some much-needed pulling-myself-together time. "So," he said, after he'd taken a sip from his glass, his tongue searching out the creamy froth left lingering around his lips. "How's your dog?" I must have seen that very manoeuvre, the tongue-licking one, performed by dozens of men newly acquainted with their pint of beer, but suddenly it had taken on a whole new level of meaning. "My dog? Ha ha, oh yes, my dog." What was... Well, I suppose it had been a long time. "She's fine. I mean, he's fine." "Milo, you mean?" The man shrugged and looked at me blankly. God, how could he possibly be expected to know the name of my dog? And what must he think of me? The first time we met, I was wading about in the river, soaked through, pretending everything was perfectly normal, and now I was a giddy wreck, babbling incoherently. "Yes, Milo's fine," I said. "Only he's not actually my dog. I was just looking after him. That's what I do for a living, you see. Well, apart from working in here. I look after dogs. Dog walking, dog sitting, that kind of thing. And pouring pints of beer, too. I was wittering on, divulging far more information than this man probably wanted to hear, but I couldn't help myself. I always spoke rubbish when I was nervous. Look, here's my card. I pulled one out from my back pocket and handed it to him. He took it and turned it over in his fingers, a bemused expression on his face. Poor man. He'd come into the pub for a quiet pint, not to be subjected to my awkward sales pitch, if that's what this was. A dog's best friend, Ellie Browne. He said the words aloud, his voice warm like sticky treacle, his effect upon me a bit treacly too, although I wasn't sure if I detected a hint of mockery to his tone. A woman of many talents, obviously, he said, with half a smile hovering on his lips. Yes, well, I like to keep busy. Scintillating, Ellie. Positively scintillating. In the background, Polly's head had shrunk into her shoulders, her eyes had narrowed, and she wore a painful grimace on her face as she made a slicing action at her throat. Shut up, Ellie, was the message loud and clear. Great, he said, nodding his head. Well, it was obvious you clearly have a way with dogs. Sarcastic or what? He was laughing at me, I felt sure, wondering what kind of dog whisperer almost drowns the animals she's supposed to be looking after and gets sopping wet and muddy in the process. And to think of all the huffing and puffing I'd been doing at the time. I cringed, wishing I could snatch back my card, but he'd already popped it into the safety of his inside pocket. I suspected I wouldn't be adding the man to my client list anytime soon. Thankfully, Eric wandered in from the back at that very moment, his large and jovial personality cutting through the atmosphere, bringing some much-needed warmth to the distinct southwesterly chill wafting in from across the bar. Everything all right, love? Eric greeted me with his customary bear hug. I wrapped my arms around his waist and rested my head on his chest, squeezing him tight. He was like a second dad to me, and in the absence of my own dad, yes, fine, I said cheerily, pulling away, aware of the man's gaze upon us. I decided now might be a good time to wash down the pumps, just so I could divert my attention away from the man seemingly taking up all the airspace in our little pub. Thankfully, any awkwardness seemed to be on my part only. Eric greeted the man fondly, as if they were old friends, and they laughed and joked together, the man seemingly perfectly at ease in his surroundings, even though I'd never seen him in here before. They quickly picked up on a conversation while I was very happy to blend into the background and leave them to it, getting on with my job, my nerves just about back under control. Polly followed me through into the back bar and handed me her empty glass, shaking her head. Very smooth, Els, very smooth. What? Maybe this is why you and I don't have any luck on the dating scene. An attractive man walks into the building and you turn into a gibbering wreck. I did not. I think you may have done. I was just a bit embarrassed, that was all. We met the other day when I was out on a walk with one of the dogs and... My voice trailed away, not wanting to remember that humiliation, just hoping I hadn't embarrassed myself any further tonight, although judging by Polly's reaction, I think I may have done. Polly giggled. I'm going to get off, but I'll see you soon, right? Her gaze drifted over in the direction of the man who was now perched on a stool. He's bloomin' gorgeous, though, don't you reckon? Is he? I said, determined not to look his way. I hadn't really noticed. Much. Chapter 4. Thankfully, I didn't have the time nor the inclination to affirm Polly's view of the man, as the pub quickly filled up and I was soon busy serving a stream of eager customers and collecting empty glasses from the tables. The convivial background of chatter, laughter, and clinking glasses always gave me a warm glow inside. It didn't really feel like hard work to be amongst people who were intent on enjoying themselves. It was later, as the crowd thinned out, that Eric came up beside me behind the bar and placed a friendly paternal arm around my shoulder. He turned me towards the man, the one I'd been carefully avoiding all night, the one I could avoid no longer, and asked, You know who this is, don't you? I smiled weakly, not having the faintest clue, but wondering if I should. Now Eric came to mention it, the man did look very familiar. Perhaps he was a celebrity. He had that kind of air about him, confident and relaxed, but in a, hey, check me out kind of way. He did look a bit like that temperamental chef off the telly. Or maybe he was an actor from that gritty thriller that was on the other night. Dark mocha eyes. Yes. Very familiar. Oh, God, stop it. Right now. Ellie? I felt the benefit of Eric's elbow in my ribs. Oops, sorry, I said, turning to look at him. Embarrassingly, I realised I'd been gawping at the man for much longer than would be considered polite. No, I don't think I do, should I? This is Max Golding, Noel's grandson. Noel? Who the heck was Noel? And why had Eric decided tonight was the night to audition me for an episode of Mastermind? Really, I had no idea what he was going on about. Yes, Noel, Noel. He nodded towards the rocking chair that nestled to one side of the Inglenook fireplace. Oh my goodness! Noel Golding! Of course, now I remembered. You're Noel's grandson? Oh, that's just marvellous. I beamed, the thought flittering into my mind that this very attractive man, there could be absolutely no denying it, probably had the impression that I wasn't quite the full ticket. Did you know him then? Yes, I knew Noel. He was such a sweetheart, always had a lovely smile on his face and a friendly word. I first started working here when I was doing my A-levels, so I remember Noel from those days. He always took a real interest in me and what I was doing. Such a lovely man. One of my favourite customers. Noel had been as much a feature of the pub as the stone-flagged floors, the oak beams and the mullioned windows. You could set your clock by him. Every day he would be in at 12 for his pint of ale, savouring it for a whole hour, chatting to whoever was in the pub at the time, or reading his newspaper if there was no one around, before making the short journey back to his little cottage at the back of the high street, in time for his lunch. In the evening he would be back again, this time for 2 pints that would last the entire night until chucking out hour. He was a lovely, charming old man, who always had a twinkle in his eye, not dissimilar to the twinkle in the eye of his grandson, who was observing me closely now. I felt a heat tingle in my cheeks. Funnily enough, I couldn't remember his grandfather ever having a similar effect upon me, or knowing even that he had a grandson. Where had Noel been hiding him all that time? Thanks. That's good to hear. Everyone always speaks very fondly of him. Max held my gaze for a moment, looking genuinely touched by my words. It was during one of my reading weeks, home from university, that I learned that Noel had died after a short illness. Everyone who knew him in Little Leyton, and that was most people, was affected in some way by his death. He was that sort of man. The type of person who leaves a For a long time afterwards, the pub seemed changed somehow without the old man's presence, and his rocking chair by the fire, where Noel would sit when he came in, remained unused for several months in respect of his memory. Have you always lived around here, then? I hoped I wasn't overstepping the mark with my question, but I hadn't realised Noel even had any family locally. I certainly couldn't remember him mentioning them. No, I came here when Gramps was ill, to look after him. I'm glad I did. He lasted only a few weeks after I arrived, but I was so pleased we had that time together. Then, afterwards, well, I'd grown to like the area so much I decided to stay. Really? Funny to think that I hadn't run into him before on any of my previous visits home. It is a lovely place to live, isn't it? Such beautiful countryside and so many beautiful walks too. Perfect dog-walking country. But then he probably knew that, having met him in the great outdoors with his 2 magnificent dogs. He nodded with a smile, as though thinking the same. Quickly, I finished up my duties behind the bar. I was just pulling on my jacket when the door opened and Johnny waltzed in. All right? He greeted Max with a broad smile as if they were old friends too. Did everyone in Little Leyton know this man, apart from me? Before coming behind the bar and slipping an arm around my waist. He kissed me enthusiastically, leaving a damp patch on my cheek, and it took all my self-will not to wipe it away with the back of my hand. I gave a sheepish grin to Max, as Johnny proceeded to crush me in a bear hug. "Nice meeting you, Ellie." Max smiled, and I felt ridiculously pleased that he'd actually remembered my name, the sound on his lips appearing seductive. Max stood up, shook Eric's hand and nodded at Johnny before walking out of the pub, carefully dodging the beams again. If there was one thing you could say about Max Golding, it was that he was definitely all man, whereas Johnny, who was scrabbling around at my side, all eager-eyed and enthusiastic, was more like a puppy in desperate need of some training. Later, as I snuggled into the crook of Johnny's arms, my hair fanning out on his pillow, I realised I'd probably been a little hasty in my assessment of his manly qualities. Okay, so I hadn't actually planned on coming home with Johnny, but somehow it had happened, like it had a habit of doing. I sighed contentedly, intoxicated by his deliciously seductive scent. He certainly had a magic touch. Maybe it was something to do with all those hours spent turning, caressing, and carving wood.